us left or right. Our American, not looking for a war, but
Okay, now for tonight's program. We have two speakers. Jim Skinner is our main speaker, and he will give us a history and a one-on-one on martial law, which is something we all need. And he will be followed by Meryl Hope, who will tell us about her personal experiences under martial law. Jim is a 24-year law enforcement veteran, trial attorney, and former prosecutor. After serving 19 years as an investigator, police officer, experience in homicide, robbery, narcotics, burglary, white collar, and public corruption investigations, he decided to pursue a law degree. And after receiving his law degree from the University of Houston in 2001, he worked as a civil lawyer in Dallas, representing numerous child victims of sexual abuse from across the United States. In 2007 and then in 2011, he served in the public sector in the Collin County District Attorney's Office in the Criminal Prosecution Division. Jim is a commissioned deputy sheriff with the Dallas County Sheriff's Department Reserve Division and works in their criminal investigations section. Jim is active as an honorary member of the North Texas Police Chiefs Association, and he is a member of both the National Sheriff's Association and the Sheriff's Association of Texas. Jim also served 8 years as a U.S. Air Force security police dog handler, investigator, and SWAT team leader. He is judge advocate for Post 110 of the American Legion in McKinney. He is married to Ellen. Ellen, wave at us. There she is. And he is currently a candidate for Collin County Sheriff, as he said, in an election to take place next year. AAP looks forward to hosting any other candidates who may file for that office. The requirement for a 501c4 is that we don't endorse, but we want to talk with all the candidates and let you have an opportunity to ask some questions. Our second speaker is Meryl Hope, originally of New York, but a longtime resident of Los Angeles, California. Meryl and her family moved to Texas from California a little over a year ago in a move she called Texodus. And she's a writer for Breitbart, Texas, specializing in education news. So we're very happy that she could be here with us tonight. So please save your questions for both until the end. And first up is Jim Skinner. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. When Tracy first contacted me about talking about martial law, I thought, oh my goodness, what a terrifying subject. Okay, as Americans, it ought to terrify us when we hear the words martial law. And then I thought, you know, here we are in a time when the fact of the matter is we have federal officials who willingly choose to ignore the rule of law and the Constitution. And sad enough, not just federal officials, but even state and local officials are just willfully ignorant of the freedoms and liberties that our Constitution enshrines. So I thought, well, you know, this is a good time to talk about martial law and give a one-on-one course, if you will, on martial law. It's going to go pretty quick. I've got a lot of slides. We're going to cover a lot of material. We probably want to hit a light up here that causes this to, so you can see it a little bit better. And we'll get started. So if you would, just hold your questions to the end, and I'll try to answer any questions that you might have as we get to the end of it. And the way I'm going to approach this is we're going to talk about martial law in the United States. We're going to define it. We're going to talk about the origins of martial law, which, you know, when you think about it, is sort of it's really interesting to me as I go through and I study about how the world came to use martial law. It's pretty interesting. We're going to talk about constitutional authority here in the United States. How is it that we have the ability to use martial law in the United States? How is it that the government has that ability to do that? Then we're going to talk about the historical perspective. When has martial law been used in the United States? Under what circumstances? We'll talk about different incidences. And we're also going to talk about the difference between the implications of martial law or instituting martial law as opposed to when the president has deployed troops, federal troops, but not declared martial law. Then we'll talk about what the Supreme Court says and how the Supreme Court defines martial law in the United States. And if we get time, we'll talk about some of the deployments of military troops throughout the United States in which martial law was not declared. My friend Andy recently reminded me that when we talk about these concepts, it's probably always good to talk about, first, the rule of law. So that subject's going to come up several times, and so we should define that. The government and its people are accountable under the law. The laws are justly and evenly applied, protecting our rights, property, and security of our citizens. The process by which laws are enforced are fair and efficient, and that there's justice is served in a timely manner by our contemporaries or our peers. Okay? This is what we know as the rule of law. The definition of martial law, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's the rule of law established and maintained by the military in the absence of civil law. And you're going to see that that's the strong underlying theme, not only in our English common law, but here in the United States. Martial law, and the courts have said the same thing, can only be implemented when there's no access to our civilian courts. So as long as Ray Wheelis is sitting up at that courthouse, up on the bench, it's not going to be martial law. Okay, here. When is it used? Natural disasters, obviously. If you have a major natural catastrophe that closes down, does not give you the ability to enforce the law or have access to the courts, martial law, unfortunately, is appropriate. But unfortunately, the stabilized insurrections or perceived insurrections, remember that we're going to make the distinction between, there's probably a big difference between martial law in Pakistan and martial law in the United States, okay? And we'll talk about the differences here in just a little bit. It's used to suppress political opposition, unfortunately, in many places in the world. And when conditions exist that prevent the government or civilian authorities from functioning efficiently, as we talked a few moments ago. And we have had that happen here in the United States. So martial law can be declared on a national level, or martial law can be declared just in a regional area. Or, in fact, it could be declared just in a city. But it has to meet that standard. An example of the use of a proper use of the use of martial law would have been the reconstruction of Europe and Japan after World War II, obviously. Here we get martial law is that ultimate force needed to restore the situation of law and order. Does anybody here speak Latin? Does anybody know how to say this in Latin? Okay. Silent inem vegus inter arma. If I'm wrong, nobody knows the difference, right? Okay. But what it means is the laws are silent amidst the clash of arms. So when we look back in history, and it makes sense, in total war, it's probably a pretty good bet that in total war, and just the devastating prospect of total war, that the courts are not going to be available, that our government is not going to be available to operate. And in such a case, martial law could be established just to have order in the midst of that chaos. There's another Latin term, salus populi suprema est lex. Safety of the people is the supreme law. And that's a Latin term that's been cited by authors in our English common law. When we talk about the beginning of around the 14th century, we started to see the legal minds in England began to talk a lot about the use of martial law. And we see in our history in common law that the British were very hesitant to implement martial law in the United Kingdom. Okay? But they didn't hesitate at all in the colonies. All right? And there's some, historically, there's just some brutal applications of martial law by the English in the colonies that they ruled around the world. So the Duke of Wellington, to me, he had the best definition. It says martial law essentially means no law at all. This guy here, Matthew Hale, he was like what we might call our Chief Justice on the Supreme Court. Okay? And essentially what he said was that martial law, it's indulged rather than allowed. Because there wasn't anything in English common law, there wasn't a law that said, defined what martial law was and allowed someone to use it, to make the application of martial law. Well, it's the same thing here in the United States. There's nothing in our Constitution that provides for anyone to declare martial law. What we have to do is look at our Constitution and interpret from that how and when it would be appropriate to call for martial law. Milligan is a Supreme Court case that occurred as a result of Lincoln suspending habeas corpus. And the Supreme Court, in this case, defined martial law as the following. It's the will of the commanding officer of an armed force or of a geographical military department, expressed in time of war within the limits of his military jurisdiction as necessity demands and prudence dictates, restrained or enlarged by the orders of his military chief or supreme executive ruler. This is how it's defined by the United States Supreme Court as a result of Lincoln's suspension of martial law. Where is the constitutional authority? Article 1, Section 9. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. So if we look at Article 1, Section 9, when we talk about the writ of habeas corpus, what is the great writ? That's what it's referred to. Well, if someone's locked up and they're confined, an attorney should be able to go to a magistrate, to a judge, go to Judge Wheelis, and present him with the writ of habeas corpus, and demand that that person be brought before the court, and a sufficient explanation be given on why that person is being detained. Okay? This is why they call it the great writ. Under any circumstances, if you file that writ of habeas corpus, it's supposed to be reviewable by a judge, and that's one of our rights in the Constitution. It compels an agency to produce the individual to court, to convince the court that the person is being reasonably held. And the suspension of habeas corpus allows an agency to hold a person without a charge. So you can see how onerous that is, all right? And how important that when our forefathers wrote that we have the right to habeas corpus, how critically important that is. So essentially in this country, if you suspend habeas corpus, you've declared martial law, okay? And that's the important thing to remember as you keep those tied together. Article 1, Section 8. To provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. So if you take Section 8 and you take Section 9, and you combine those together, this is the basis upon which that the courts have sanctioned the use of martial law in the United States. Well, let's get right to it. The War of 1812, General Andrew Jackson, in December of 1814, he's in New Orleans, and he's very concerned because the British are about to invade New Orleans. He has a problem because the legislature, he thinks, is fixing to capitulate, and because they're so concerned about their property in New Orleans being damaged or destroyed, he can't get people signed up to join his army. So General Jackson declares martial law. All right? And I can assure you his rule was draconian. If you'll study the issue. So he took New Orleans, a 4-mile radius within his camp, and he shut it down. And he closed down the legislature. He posted guards around it. He threatened to jail or imprison any of the legislators that defied his orders. He had absolute power. He was the one that they went by and forced people to join his army. As it turned out, of course, in January the following month, the British did attack, and they inflicted 2,000 casualties on the British and made them pack their bags and head on home. So they took a pretty bad licking. The funny part about this is, though, is that when it was over, Jackson, he wouldn't suspend martial law. He said, you know what? He said, the mail runs a little slow, and I haven't heard it from Washington, and until I do, because all you folks have some pretty bad attitudes here, we're going to keep martial law. So what happened is a judge, sorry Judge Wheelis, but what a judge did was he demanded a writ of habeas corpus was presented to him. He approved it. It was served on Jackson, and Jackson said, "Well, I'm not going to abide by it. As a matter of fact, you're under arrest." So he locked the judge up. Not long after that, order was restored. He got word from Washington. He suspended martial law. The judge fined him $1,000, and Congress paid it. Okay, Jackson paid it. He got reimbursed. So there you go. And Jackson's argument all along, and this is what the courts also talk about, is it was out of necessity. I'm backed against the wall. These guys are fixing to give up the ship. I had to declare martial law, and that's the situation that I was in. So history says that Jackson, in the end, was right. Well, I don't know if there was another way to handle it. That's what he did, and as it worked out, we move on to the Civil War. We all know that Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. You know, when the war first got spun up, what happened was, as President Lincoln, he suspended habeas corpus and a number of other things before Congress, the legislature met. Okay, and as a result of that, back in 1861, there was a case called Merryman. In the Merryman case, when Lincoln first wanted to do this, Congress wouldn't go along with the suspension of writ of habeas corpus. I mean, everybody understands how unbelievably important that it is that we maintain that right. And Congress wouldn't go along with Lincoln's request, so he did it anyways. Okay, and in this case, this guy Merryman, he was in Maryland, and essentially what he did was he talked bad about the government. He was really an insurrectionist. He gathered an army of Confederate sympathizers, and he was going to move out to the South, and the federal troops arrested him and jailed him. And of course, what he did was he filed through the legal process. He filed suit. It went up on appeal and went to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says that essentially, as a part of this opinion, that Lincoln couldn't be the one to suspend habeas corpus. That's only something that can be done by Congress. Okay? A couple of years later, Lincoln gets he gets approval from Congress. Okay? And he imposes martial law across the entire United States. This is the only time that we've ever had a national application of martial law. All right? Habeas corpus was suspended on draft dodgers, prisoners of wars, spies, abettors of the enemy. And here's the thing. The courts were in operation at the time. And so when this was tested later, that was the standard. Okay? Remember, if the courts are available and the courts are open, the civil authority, it's not appropriate to suspend habeas corpus or declare martial law. So as part of this case, Lambert Milligan, he was arrested out in the territory of Indiana as a Confederate sympathizer. He was tried by a military tribunal, convicted, and sentenced to death by hanging. Okay, he filed an appeal, it went up through the courts, and the courts were asked to decide whether or not the military commission had the power to try him as a civilian, because the courts, the civil courts, were actually open, right? So here's what the Supreme Court said. I know that's a lot to digest, but this is really important to understand, because this is the bedrock case that we have that defines for us how martial law would be looked at in the United States. If in a foreign invasion or civil war the courts are actually closed and it's impossible to administer criminal justice according to the law, then on the theater of active military operations where war really prevails, there's a necessity to furnish a substitute for the civil authority thus overthrown to preserve the safety of the army and society. And as no power is left but the military, it's allowed to govern by martial law until the laws can have their free course. So they said it's unconstitutional. As necessity creates the rule, so it limits its duration. After the courts are reinstated, it's a gross usurpation of power. You know, I pulled a comment off that Sir James Mackintosh, back some 300 years before the Civil War, wrote. He said about the imposition of martial law: if it survives in the necessity on which it rests for a single minute, it becomes a mere exercise of lawless violence. So the point being, if you are going to declare martial law because there are no courts and the situation is so totally out of hand that you have to use it to restore order, because of that necessity, as soon as that necessity ends, that very instant, we're back to what we know, okay? And that's due process and the rule of law. Okay? Martial law can never exist where the courts are open in the proper and unobstructed exercise of their jurisdiction. It's also confined to the locality of actual war. These are the words of our Supreme Court, who defines what that standard will be for the American use of martial law. So did we do that in the future? Well, let's talk about that. The Coeur d'Alene, you know, I noticed on here the translation between an Apple and your computer has some of the characters not capitalized. So. Idaho, this is...
I also went through and misspelled a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Steve. You know, I hope I can get it. Idaho Governor Frank Steunenberg declared martial law and requested federal troops to back Hartsman against 3,000 striking miners up in Idaho. You know, back in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, as you know, there was a lot of strikes, violent, deadly strikes that occurred. Railway workers, coal miners, longshoremen, all these types of folks, you know, trying to get unions formed and for wages and working conditions. So here in Idaho, these miners, they had been at it, conflicting with the mine owners for some period of time, who got these scabs to come in and work the jobs, and there was a lot of bad feelings, and these guys ended up blowing up the building, and several people were killed. The mine owners, what they did was they went to the governor and they asked for martial law. Also, the president at the time issued a proclamation for the persons, remember, in insurrection to stand down, okay? 600 miners were arrested, or thereabouts. And martial law took place from April the 1st to September the 29th of 1892 in this situation. The San Francisco earthquake in 1906, this is pretty interesting. You talk about total devastation, and you talk about a situation where here you didn't have access to the courts, okay? Because, folks, San Francisco was on fire. And following the earthquakes, Presidio, the federal troops from Presidio were pressed into service, okay? And they confiscated dynamite, guarding it, and they guarded against the looters. Well, what these guys did was they used the dynamite to blow holes in the path of the firestorms that were raging in order to put the fires out, okay? And, but here's the distinction. Here, they took their orders directly from the civil authorities. The civil law enforcement authorities in San Francisco were the ones that were in charge. issuing those orders. So there was no order to implement martial law. Colorado Coalfield Wars. In 1913, for decades, this conflict had been going on. The Colorado governor activated the Colorado National Guard in order to suppress the people who were rioting in a town called Ludlow. Well, it didn't work out so good. What happened was when the National Guard got there, they were heavy-handed, and they set up a heavy machine gun, and they opened fire on a tent city where these rioters were, and they killed a bunch of women and children. And as a result of that, the uprising got completely out of hand. There was like a small war that took place for the next 10 days over a 40-mile stretch of territory up and down the railway, where a lot of people were killed. And it's called one of the deadliest strikes in the history of the United States. But what happened here was President Wilson finally got involved, and he declared martial law and activated federal troops who went in and sent the National Guard to the house. Okay, and you know, a lot's been written about this, but here's a situation where what happened was they went in and told the National Guard, "You're out of here," and they restored order, and then of course it went on from there. And we had martial law in Texas. Does anybody know?
Houston.
Yeah, just north of Houston. You bet. Right. 1931, Ross Sterling, our governor then, ordered the Rangers and the National Guard to enforce the Railroad Commission regulations in East Texas. And here's a situation where our legislature approved the Railroad Commission regulations limiting the production of oil and increasing the acreage between the wells because there was a glut going on. The price was going down. The government in Texas was very concerned. They would issue these proration orders, but the guys that own the wells would say, "Look, buddy, this is capitalism. It's free enterprise. We're going to pump all that stuff out of the ground we can." And so what they did was they couldn't get anybody's attention, and the state says, "Well, we want to preserve the reservoir to stable the price of crude. What are we going to do?" Well, so he sends the National Guard and the Texas Rangers to East Texas to shut down 1,644 oil wells and then bring them back online in some kind of fashion where the government was going to dictate how much they could do. The whole field could do 400 barrels a day. So, I'm sorry, 400,000 barrels a day. So each well was limited to like 225 barrels. Okay? Federal court stepped in 6 months later and ruled it illegal. Texas didn't appreciate that, and so as a result of that, right after that ruling, one after another, they continued to issue these proration orders issued by the Texas Railroad Commission, trying to get it under control. And it was litigated. And what happened is the case was heard by the United States Supreme Court, and they invalidated Sterling's use of martial law because it violated the constitutional due process rights of the property owners. Remember? Life, liberty, and property. So here was a situation where when they declared martial law and tried to be heavy-handed, it was a situation where it violated those individuals' property rights. So the Supreme Court sided with them. In 1934, Frank Merriman, oh, by the way, I was going to tell you too that remember the Idaho governor that declared martial law, he was murdered a few years after that when he left office. Somebody blew him and his family up and killed him with a dynamite bomb in his house. It was a sad story. Here, Frank Merriman put San Francisco under martial law due to a dock workers strike. And what happened was the waterfront worker strike was occurring all the way from Seattle all the way down the western coast of the United States. And it was a very paralyzing effect on the economy at the time, up and down the Pacific coast. And in July the 5th, Bloody Thursday, the picketers and the police They hooked it up. There were several deaths that occurred. National Guard troops were ordered to patrol the waterfront, and then they deployed federal troops to deploy over in Oakland, and then the situation was brought back under control, and the strike ended, and it went on. But there was a great loss of life. As we know, martial law, probably all Americans know that martial law was instituted on December the 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. But what happened here is President Roosevelt was notified by the governor of the territory of Hawaii that he was going to relinquish his authority over to General Short. It was sent by cable to Roosevelt, who approved it. It was an extremely draconian set of rules that the military instituted there in the Hawaiian Islands. The military was authorized to arrest and convict people by military tribunals. They established military courts, and in these, the writ of habeas corpus was suspended throughout the islands. People could be locked up and indefinitely while they were waiting to be tried by a military tribunal. The rules of evidence were suspended. No rules of evidence in a trial. You can imagine that, Judge, having a trial with no rules of evidence. It doesn't matter what your constitutional rights are, or how you got the evidence, or whether it's authenticated or not. You can just use it. I can't imagine that. Because we live in a system where if you show up at the courthouse and you've got evidence illegally obtained, he's going to put you down the road and he's going to release that defendant. Okay? I mean, what you're not going to do is you're not going to use that evidence in the case to convict that person. Okay? So, also there's no limits on sentencing that they had. So, think about this as we go through the rules. No free speech or right to assemble. A strict curfew enforced. Firearms were prohibited. All U.S. currency was seized. You couldn't carry more than $200 in script. They banned liquor. Gasoline was rationed. Everybody over 6 years old was fingerprinted, and everybody had to have a government ID. They censored all the mail. They monitored the phone calls. Shortwave radios were banned. You couldn't travel between the islands, and there was a total blackout enforced. And if you didn't abide by the blackout, you went to jail. Okay, so it was pretty draconian, but it was in a time of war, and they thought that this was appropriate. Well, I can tell you that when you look at this from a historical perspective, there was a lot of debate back in the mainland United States about the use of martial law in the Hawaiian Islands. And even the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, here's what he had to say. The idea that restoring the responsibility of civil government and the jurisdiction of the courts would hamper the defense of the territory by the Army and the Navy is repugnant of every concept of American democracy. And, I just couldn't agree more. And there was a lot of people, it was a big issue during the Second World War about the use of martial law, because this wasn't the only place martial law was declared. Does anybody know where else it was declared? Western coast of the United States, all the way down the western coast and into Arizona. Okay? So one of the federal judges, towards the end of the war, he said it becomes unlawful as soon as the civilian government is capable and willing to resume its normal functions. So see, again, as we saw in the Civil War, we have the courts continuing to drive home the point that if the courts, if they're available, it's not appropriate to declare martial law. Okay? But here, it went on for 6 more months before they ended it. Governor Poindexter declared lawful martial law, but the Army went beyond the governor set up which was lawful only in conquered enemy territory, namely a military government, which is not bound by the Constitution. And they threw the Constitution into the discard and set up a military dictatorship. This was written in an opinion by Frank McLaughlin in the federal case that came before the court as a result of somebody filing suit over their unlawful detention. How am I doing on time?
No cards yet.
Okay. All right. So here's some of the cases that resulted in that. This guy was an MP. He arrested Duncan, who was for public intoxication. Believe it or not, this case ended up going all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Okay? But again, it said the same thing. They couldn't hold Duncan and charge him. He should have had access to the civilian courts. On the west coast of the United States, as we talked a few minutes ago, this mainly had to do with the detention of Japanese Americans. There was like 120,000 Japanese that were detained. 2/3 of those were second and third generation Japanese, believe it or not. Okay, only 40,000 of those were people that had come, from Japan. So, anyways, they implemented martial law in this situation. But here, what the courts did was they ruled that it was appropriate, the curfews that were placed on these Japanese Americans during the war, okay, because of military necessity. Essentially, it said that they could institute these kinds of things against members of a minority group that were part of or from the country, or their ancestors were from the country that our country is at war with, is essentially what they said. So that's how they tried to authorize that. Of course, as we know, in recent times, there have been reparations paid to these families and these people, and they've been apologized to. Korematsu is a case where this guy essentially was, he was just a guy who said, I'm not leaving my house in California. I'm going to live in my house. I'm not going to go from this, I'm not going to abide by this proclamation that forces us to turn ourselves in at this internment camp. I'm going to stay in my house. So eventually they go and they arrest him. They try him, and he's convicted. He appeals it. It goes up to the United States Supreme Court. But they held that the need to protect against espionage outweighed his individual rights and the rights of people of Japanese descent. I thought it was interesting in Fred Korematsu's case, the jury was out for 10 minutes and convicted him. Yeah. So I guess folks felt pretty strong about it. Everybody here probably remembers Kent State. What a tragedy. So 500 students in May of 1970, they get together and they get a copy of the Constitution and they go out and dig a hole and they bury it. And they're having a burial of the United States Constitution to protest Nixon's encroachment into Cambodia during the Vietnam War. Okay? They got busted up as a result of that by the local police. There was a riot. The next day, 1,000 people burned the ROTC building at Kent State University. It escalated from there and got out of control. The governor of Ohio, James Milowich, he declared limited martial law. He deployed the National Guard troops there, and as we know, 77 of those guardsmen opened fire on a group of students that were protesting, and they killed 2 of the protesters, and they killed 2 innocent students who were just walking to classes, and they wounded 9 others. And it was a bad deal. As you might imagine, the survivors of the students who were killed filed suit, and it ended up at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in this case, ruled that they could be held liable. Those government officials that declared martial law and deployed those troops and were in command, that did not have total immunity, but they had qualified immunity, okay? And that they could be held responsible. So in that opinion, the court wrote that martial law is an act of last resort, okay? And troops can only be used if it's necessary and proper. The Watts riots, who remembers that? Yeah, I actually, as a kid in the 60s, I remember the Watts riots. So in 1965, 15,000 National Guard troops were deployed in the city of Los Angeles, in the city of Watts. So in this situation, it started with a traffic stop. Lee Minkus, a California Highway Patrolman motor officer, pulled over a guy named Marquette Fry for suspicion of DWI. He had his brother and his mother in the car with him. He didn't get the guy didn't cooperate. There became words back and forth. He ended up handcuffing Mr. Fry. There was a struggle. Mom got involved because she didn't want to see her son handled that way. The situation escalated out of control. There were some rocks and bottles thrown by bystanders, and so it erupted into a small incident. And this small incident, when the police responded, the way they handled it, it erupted into a big incident. Okay, and it resulted in 5 days of looting, the vandalizing of property. They beat passing motorists and set fires, and there was a lot of property damage involved. These pictures were taken on August the 13th of '65. 3 days later, there's the National Guard. And it was a bad deal. 34 people died. Over 1,000 people injured, and 118 of them of the injured suffered from gunshot wounds. Now we're going to have Merrill talk about this in just a little bit, so I'm just going to review it very briefly. But the Los Angeles riots, you remember the Rodney King incident? You know, as they put up there, can we all get along? Rodney King was beaten by a group of Los Angeles police officers. It was filmed on video following a pursuit. The officers were ultimately charged and tried in state court in California, in Superior Court, and acquitted. And when, after the acquittal, the town broke into a terrible riot in which they used 9,800 California National Guardsmen, troops from the 1st Marine Division in California, and from the 7th Infantry Division were deployed to Los Angeles to bring this situation back under control, because the police had absolutely no ability at all to take care of the problem. But now remember, this was not, and it's commonly thought that in this situation that martial law was declared. There wasn't the mayor had talked about martial law, but what it was is he implemented a dusk to dawn curfew that was rigorously enforced by the military. And 53 people killed, 2,300 injured, 13,000 arrested, but they still had access to the civil courts. Okay, so they would, in many cases, they would arrest people, take them out of the situation. They'd have to cite people and turn them loose because, you know, they just didn't have the jail capacity to deal with it. Okay? $700 million in property damage. Katrina. We all remember Katrina. So in August of 2005, Katrina rips through New Orleans and Louisiana. I think this is a really interesting case, because here is a case where what you find is you find that there was a struggle, if you will, between the federal government and the governor of Louisiana in this case. You guys all remember in Katrina, you saw the news show. The one image that I can't get out of my mind is I remember that there was a little silver-haired woman, and the police showed up at her house, and there was a film crew with them. It was about ankle deep, you know, or knee deep in water. And when she came out, she had her pistol. Yeah. She took her pistol and she held out this little nickel-plated silver pistol, and she got dogpiled by 3 police officers. I mean, right there on camera, they gun, and they jumped on her like she was some criminal, you know. And so what we found out is that Ray Nagin, who's currently serving time in a federal penitentiary, on other charges, okay. But also the Jefferson Parish president, Broussard, declared martial law in their respective jurisdictions. It was illegal. They could not declare martial law in Louisiana. There's no provision to declare martial law in Louisiana, okay? Because under their state law in Louisiana, there's a different mechanism. It's the use of state police powers, or to deal with an emergency situation, not a declaration of martial law. And certainly they weren't authorized to go and forcibly take people out of their homes and to take their firearms, okay? That was all litigated, and ultimately the courts, of course, you know, came down with some blistering opinions that said, you know, I don't know what you're thinking, but you didn't have a right to take somebody's guns from them. You didn't have a right to force them out of their home. Okay? So the state of public health emergency is the laws that they had. So when we have a natural disaster response, what are the two legal constructs that we have in order to deal with that? Obviously, one of them that we've been talking about is martial law. And what do we know now? We know that that could be used, for example, if the courts are closed, there's no access, there's no ability to use the civil courts or civil authorities, and there's no government that exists. Then martial law would be declared, federal troops could be deployed in, military government set up under those circumstances. But the law of public emergency, on the other hand, the use of state police powers that we have is another way to handle it, a more appropriate way to handle it, okay? And in many cases in our history, if we've had a situation where, and we'll talk about some of those in a few minutes, but the situation is out of control and just the police can't handle it, the military is ordered in to assist. Well, then we have the implications of posse comitatus, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes too. But those are the two ways. So when Katrina happened, so what happened? President Bush, he offered to federalize 13,000 federal troops and to come in and to put it under a federal military command under General Honoré. But Governor Blanco, she at first was indecisive, and actually what happened was the president was at the White House on the way to the briefing room to make the announcement that that's what they were going to do when she called up there to tell him no, that she had considered it and that's not what they were going to do. So at the last second, the president didn't make his announcement, and instead, because the president knew that the Posse Comitatus Act was going to be an obstacle, okay, in that situation. So what they ended up doing in this situation is Bush ultimately sent 7,000 troops, federal troops, for relief efforts, okay, which was appropriate. All right, so we talk about the Posse Comitatus. You know, Posse Comitatus is an English common law term that essentially means vaguely the assistance of the community. Okay, you and the sheriff and his posse, that's where that comes from, is Posse Comitatus, the common law term that, because in England they had laws that said if the sheriff showed up and needed assistance, you had to help. And in some communities in the western United States back in the 1800s, they had a similar law where they said if the sheriff needed a posse and he said you got to go, you got to go. Okay, go catch the bad guys. Well, so the Posse Comitatus Act is essentially a law that says that the military cannot act in civilian law enforcement. Separates the military from law enforcement applications in the United States. But there are exceptions. There are 4 exceptions, okay? In Posse Comitatus, the military can work with local authorities in situations that involve the use of the use of weapons of mass destruction, to suppress an insurrection or other civil disturbance that obstructs the execution of federal law, or again, impedes the course of justice and ordinary judicial proceedings. You see the same language used. So you're going to see in a few minutes that there's a lot of other times that the military was used, and I just got the 5-minute card, and that's what they did. This is the one that they used in order to give them authority to deploy federal troops. And then the military purpose doctrine, when military people assist civil law enforcement to achieve a military purpose. What's that? If they have a murder on a military base and the military investigators, they can still investigate that murder out and with civilian authorities, for example. If they're looking for a deserter, for example, that's another instance in which they can do that. Okay? So, Louisiana is a great example of a state using their emergency powers by rejecting, the offer by the federal government to impose martial law. Okay? We talked about this a few minutes ago, the use of state police powers. What is that? Well, this is the definition. It's the capacity of the states to regulate behavior and enforce order within their territory for the betterment of the health, safety, morals, and general welfare of their inhabitants. And as we know, that's derived from the 10th Amendment. So I've got about 2 minutes left before we start actually before Marilyn talks. I want to run through real quick, just to give you an example. I won't explain each one of them, But each one of these is where it was used, federal troops were used by the government without a declaration of martial law. Okay? Washington in the Whiskey Rebellion, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Homestead Steel Strike. This was a particularly bloody affair. The Pullman Railroad Strike in 1894. Everybody remembers this? Little Rock 9, Eisenhower. I sent the National Guard in to escort 9 black students into Little Rock High School. 63, Kennedy did the same thing, University of Alabama. Riots in Rochester, New York. And of course, we all remember the disaster in Waco. So these three are what the government has relied on, our federal government has relied on to use federal troops. These are the laws. They were changed. The Militia Act of 1792 was changed to the Militia Act of 1903, and then finally the National Defense Act of 1916. I bet I'm out of time. Okay.
Thank you.
I am sneaky. I'm a reporter. Everything that you just heard does not apply when you come from the land of the slow-speed chase, where I live most of my life.
Meryl, I can't hear you.
You can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
This is being on the cell phone. Can I take this off? What matters more than the actual events that happened, we had, in my lifetime, martial law twice in Los Angeles. Now, because of the 24-hour psychotic reporting of the Rodney King incident in '91, that by the time this went to court, it was like insane. So it was no longer Mayor Bradley, it was now Mayor Reardon, and it was a disaster. But it was a disaster in a very small space. What they declared martial law over was the fear of what might happen. I didn't live anywhere near it. I lived the equivalent between if you were from South Dallas to where we are, McKinney. And the alarming thing about it were the things I remember in terms of my impressions, because it really was dusk to dawn. So you're sitting there in your office, you gotta go. You gotta get home. Because if you didn't, you got fined. And if there was worse potentially you're being threatened with if you didn't abide. So it was a very screwy time because they were threatening they were gonna march up the 405 freeway, which is like 75. And they're gonna come to the good neighborhoods. Well, there were plenty of good neighborhoods long before that because Beverly Hills was much closer than we ever were. So we were in the suburbs. And what I think back on it, because you see it with different eyes. At the time, I was young, and you just thought the whole thing was kind of stupid. But you couldn't do things, and you really didn't leave your house till 7 in the morning, and I think it was right after daylight savings time. So the minute it got dark, you had to be in before it got dark. What I think was left a much more lasting impression on me is when they declared martial law in the '94 earthquake. That was freaky because unlike with the Rodney King situation where, you're sitting there and, crickets where you are. Because where the actual rioting was taking place was nowhere near most of us. This affected us. This affected everyone in Los Angeles. And it was just like in a bad science fiction movie because there were all kinds of rules and regulations besides the fact that you couldn't leave. When you could leave, it was odd and even days for gas It was odd and even days for bank, the ATM, and at first there was no electricity, so there was no gas, no bank. And I think when I think back on what I remember with the market was there was no food. So, it's a funny thing because I think of it now with very different eyes than I did at the time. I was young. I had no money in my wallet. I had just been the night before covering something in Hollywood. I was a reporter then too, and I didn't really. It just didn't dawn on me. The only thing I actually owned that was a help to me was that a woman I knew sold earthquake kits, and she said, "You might be a good idea in case we have an earthquake." So I bought a 3-day kit, and we had no communications. My mother was living in Arizona and had no idea that I was alive because she heard on CNN that the street I lived on blew up. And I couldn't even call her. I had to have someone in the city, in West Hollywood, call on her fax phone to get through to my mother to say I wasn't dead. So we had no electricity for weeks. We had no peace either because we had unbelievable tremors for a good 6-8 weeks. But I think the lessons that I learned were from the impressions, especially in today's world. You just can't go out. When they say you're not going out, you're not going out. FEMA was across the street from the apartment building I lived in at the time. People were living there because they had no place to live. People were knocking on doors saying, "My building collapsed. Are there any vacancies?" Of course, all those building collapsed exposed unbelievable cutting of corners and corruption in the entire building industry, which was then years and years and years of lawsuits. But I think by today's standards, looking back on that, and then we didn't have martial law for this, but I lived where they had tons of fires, and we've been evacuated. And that's another whole situation where I think what always struck me is people in Los Angeles who at least had the threats of fires and floods and mudslides and earthquakes, you would think that they would have provisions. But they never think it's going to happen to them, even when it's happening. And my husband had been the Homeowners Association president, and he brought in a guide with a survival company, for emergencies. It happened as we were all being evacuated one night. So I think it puts into perspective that these things do happen. And martial law isn't always declared because of, a threat, from a military threat, or it can be something as simple as an earthquake. So those are my memories.
He put that whole program together, just because we asked, and I can't tell him how much I appreciate him for it. It was great. It's the most thorough explanation of martial law I think I've ever sat down and seen, heard, listened, read of anything. So thank you.
Don't label us left or right. Our American. Not looking for a war, but we came to fight. Our American. Somebody's gotta stand up. Somebody's gotta do